Dude, we can now say we live in a world where Lance Stroll was 6.5 seconds away from a podium.
How long has it been?
He hasn't had a start like this since he got fourth in Australia.
Are Aston Martin back for the last two races of the year? Are we seeing a push for the finish? Are they going for number 2?
Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to another episode of Turn 1 Podcast with your host, Jeremiah.
And Thomas.
We are covering today the Brazilian Grand Prix, Sao Paulo Grand Prix. So, we're going to do a brief kick on the weekend wrap-up. We're going to jump into the Turn 1 analysis, then we're going to dive into the actual race itself. Thomas, do you have anything for this race before we get started?
So we did a preview, which we'll link up in the top right, but Sao Paulo is one of those fantastic tracks on the F1 circuit. Years past, there's been a lot of weather. Obviously, it's a very rainy city. There's some nicknames referring to drizzle, and they're in Spanish or Portuguese or things like that. But it's a fantastic track. I don't think we had a lot of weather this weekend, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have people sliding off the track constantly throughout the various events. So I'm excited to get into it. Jeremiah, let's get through the race quali and the sprint events before we dive into the actual Grand Prix.
We'll talk about practice first because Lando and Nico collided in a practice session, which I don't think I've ever seen in any of the races that I've watched at all. Like practice.
Maybe they were practicing for the race, and because they only get one practice session, they just had to do it in practice one because they're like, well, we're gonna do it anyway, so got to knock it out here.
Maybe something like that. We'll jump into the qualifying. Q1, Russell's slow in the pit exit. Definitely going to get a penalty for that one, which he does. 2-place grid penalty. Almost causes Pierre to collide into the back of him. However, Pierre and Esteban Ocon also holding up traffic. Therefore, Pierre, Russell, and Ocon all going to start 2-place grid penalty for impeding. Tsunoda, Ricciardo, Bottas, Sargent, and Zhou all out in Q1. Q2, we see Hulk, Ocon, Gasly, Magnussen, and Albon all out. And in Q3, we get rain. So people are only able to get a couple laps in, if even that. And Piastri not able to get any laps at all as he slips right off the track, causing a yellow flag. We have Max, Leclerc, Stroll, Alonso, Hamilton, Russell, Norris, Sainz, Perez, and Piastri. I'm going to repeat that again. Max, Leclerc, Stroll, Alonso in the 3 and 4 spot starting for Sunday's race. Wow.
It's been at least 12 races, maybe more, since they've both been in the top 10 in quali.
I'm a fan. Why not? Let's throw in a little sauce out there. Who cares?
They started out the year so hot, and we know the other teams came out with the upgrade packages. Maybe it's just something. I mean, I don't think they really had a substantial upgrade package. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know they introduced one 2 weeks ago, right? Because both Stroll and Alonso were running different car specs.
Right.
Maybe that just worked at Sao Paulo.
I think they just got it right in FP1 because we know at these sprint weekends, you only get one practice session to set up your car for the rest of the weekend, which is still ridiculous to me. So I think they just got it right. And there's other teams out there that just did not get it right whatsoever. Mercedes. We'll go into the sprint shootout. SQ1, we see Esteban Ocon hitting Alonso, who was on a slow lap, and giving him plenty of room. He had a hint of oversteer, tried to do a correction coming out of the corner, got a little too close to Alonso, clips the wheel, and off goes Ocon. We see Ocon, Stroll, Zhou, Albon, and Sargent out in SQ1. Going into SQ2, because Alonso had that damage, we see him out in that 15 spot. But in front of him, we see Magnussen, Hülkenberg, Gasly, and Bottas all going out. Both Haas's out. That stinks. But whatever. SQ3, we see Lando, Max, Perez, Russell, and Hamilton taking your top 5. We see Tsunoda, Leclerc, Ricciardo, Sainz, and Piastri taking that bottom 5. Now, I don't know about you, but that's more like what I expected to see. This whole Stroll and Alonso sneaking into that top 5 blew my mind. But hey, Tsunoda gets into the top 10. So does Ricciardo, AlphaTauri.
The AlphaTauris had a halfway decent, sprint shootout performance, but then every other part of the weekend wasn't as good.
Well, you'll have that, I guess. We'll dive right on into the sprint. Not a lot of action in the sprint, as there's typically not unless there's some kind of collisions or anything like that. Mercedes had a strong start as they jumped to 2 and 4. That kind of backs off as their tires start to go all the way out of the building. Max takes the lead in turn 1, holds on to it for the entire thing. There's no fighting that. There's just none. Haas started on the mediums, and the only other car that was on the mediums was Logan Sargent, which should tell you everything that you need to know.
One of the things to watch for if you're watching this on ESPN or Sky Sports or the F1 TV subscription, all the broadcasts do kind of that pre-race intro before every event. So before the quali, before the sprint, whatever, and they show the track layout, they show the turns, they show where the overtake areas are, and they always talk about the tire compounds. And when we go to Sao Paulo every year, they always say that the medium and hards are not the preferred compounds of the teams. They want to be on the softs as long as possible. So going with the mediums in a no pit stop race is it's a bold strategy, Cotton. It's a bold strategy.
I think they just expected the race to come back to them at the end. It didn't, as both Haas's end up way back from where they started in that shootout or in the sprint race. Russell and Perez had a pretty awesome battle for the first half of the race, but like I said, after that tire degradation sets in, that kind of went away. But I'll give you the top 5 finishers for that sprint race. We had Max, Lando, Perez, Russell, and Leclerc.
I really enjoyed watching Sergio all this weekend. We'll get to his race performance, obviously, in the Grand Prix. But for a guy that's been kind of middle of the pack past few weeks and he has to really work his way up, he was kind of always towards the front.
I enjoyed it. We saw a return of Perez, which was awesome. And it wasn't even just like in one race. I mean, all around weekend, he was quick. In fact, he was not that far off of Max in the practice sessions in terms of their times, which was kind of surprising because he's been miles back like for the whole second half of the season.
I think it's 2 things. One thing that you mentioned and one thing that I mentioned. One, I think Sao Paulo is just a different track, right? It's super slick. It's a good combination of speed and agility. But then, like you mentioned, with a sprint weekend, you get one practice. And if you're in a car that's had some changes with it, or you don't have a lot of data on or something like that, it really levels the playing field. And you can get kind of this hodgepodge of drivers and teams that you haven't had before, where you have the Aston Martins in the top 10. You have AlphaTauri getting in the top 10. You have Perez competing. Everything about this weekend was awesome.
Definitely. I was a fan of the sprint race. It's a short one, but I enjoyed it. It was a good race. We'll move into the actual race itself, the Sunday feature race, and my personal favorite, the turn 1 breakdown, especially for this weekend, because we had all kinds of craziness happen in this turn 1, and I'm going to try and do my best to do this as much justice as I can. I watched so many onboards, I listened to so many radios trying to get exactly what happened in the back, especially. So here we go. So we had a great getaway from Verstappen as he holds position, takes off into first. Stroll with not the best start. He's going to lose positions to Norris and Hamilton. Alonso with a decent start, getting past his teammate in Stroll, but again, not as strong compared to the Mercedes and McLaren of Hamilton and Norris. Hamilton gets a great start, passing both of the both of the Aston Martins, and Norris with a rocket start, passing Hamilton, Alonso, and Stroll, climbing to that second spot and holding on for dear life. Sainz bogs down at the start. He's going to lose positions to Russell and Perez, who both had a great start and charged right past him. Piastri gets a good getaway, but then takes a tire to the rear wing and gets damage off the jump. So now we're going to see him, unfortunately, have to go into the pits and do what he can during the red flag. Speaking of the red flag, let's get into that. Hülkenberg, Magnussen, Albon. That was the starting 3 for 10, 11, 12 spot. I say 10, 11, 12 instead of 11, 12, 13 because one name we haven't mentioned, Charles Leclerc, who biffed it in the formation lap because he completely lost his hydraulics. His steering was gone, his braking was gone, and he slides right into the wall. That stinks for Ferrari.
There was nothing Leclerc could do about that. And at first they thought maybe he got a little, went squirrely on him or something, but no,
Right.
you see the plume of smoke come out of the car as he's going straight down the track, and then he immediately flies off. So a rough day for Charles Leclerc on the formation lap. But turn one was almost really uneventful.
We'll get into the action right
Almost.
here. Like I said, we got Hülkenberg, Magnussen, Albon. Hülkenberg with not the best start as Magnussen goes charging past him on the inside. Albon even gets a good run as he's now on the outside of Hülkenberg. And here again, just like in Qatar with Ocon and Sergio Perez, Hülkenberg's right in the middle. They start to get a little too close to him. He slams on the brakes, tries to get out of it, but he can't. So unfortunately, he's going to nip that back tire of Albon, causing Albon to slide right into Magnussen, taking both of them out. Hülkenberg's able to continue, but he's badly damaged. So he's going to have to go into the pits and do some damage control there. We see Albon's tire come off. And like I said, that's the tire that slaps the back of Piastri's wing. That's going to cause damage to that back wing. But that tire continues to take damage as it then goes into the back of Daniel Ricciardo and destroys his rear wing. So now he's going to have to go into the pits and do some damage control on that. Ocon right behind Albon is able to move to the inside and avoid the debris. Same with Gasly. He brakes early and then moves to the inside. We see Tsunoda moving to the inside and braking. And Ricciardo, unfortunately, we already talked about his rear wing, gets the damage. Bottas, Sargent, Zhou, all braking early, moving to the inside to try and get around this damage. I feel bad for Zhou because he had a great start, immediately jumps Sargent and starts charging towards his teammate in Bottas, but then immediately has to slam on the brakes to avoid all the problems up ahead.
I think you got it.
I think I did.
Okay, looking back through really quickly, and we mentioned Leclerc, he didn't start the race, so Verstappen did start in very clean air with no one next to him, which was nice. Hamilton, Norris sandwiched the Aston Martins, and I thought right off the jump Aston Martin's day was about to be ruined because they were just getting passed off the line, and I was like, okay, it was a fluke that they qualified that high. They're going to drop back to like 8 and 9 now, and that's where they're going to race. I was wrong. I mean, they dropped back temporarily, but the field kind of worked its way out to where they ended up finishing around where they started. For these cars to be millions of dollars, when you go back and watch that slow motion of Albon's tire landing on Danny Rick's back wing, that thing just crumples like a toothpick. And it was snapped in half.
It was tough because I watched some of the onboards from the cars that were behind Daniel Ricciardo, and as he's going into turn one, you just see his rear wing doing this little dance back and forth as it's clearly damaged. Oh,
because when it landed on there, like it didn't break off, but it like almost flexed all the way down to the ground and then popped back into place. But it wasn't going to be very stable at 200 miles an hour for the rest of the day.
People don't realize how much force these tires have when they pop off of a car and they start going. These cars, they're hauling, man. So that tire's got all that momentum. Also, these tires are heavy. Regardless of the fact that it didn't have its rim and it was just a tire at that point, it's still hitting with plenty of force to damage those carbon fiber rear wings.
I was trying to see how much a Pirelli tire weighs, and I can't get an exact figure, but it's got to be something significant. And again, the F1 cars, they're sturdy, but they also have a tendency to explode on contact. So that makes a lot of sense. Albon, we've talked him up in the past couple of races and throughout 2023. He squeezed himself. There wasn't a gap to be had there. He was way too aggressive off the start. He did get a good start. Like, don't get me wrong.
Oh,
Albon had a chance, but that wasn't it to go into the grass on the outside lane. He tries to squeeze past Hulk. He ends up bumping Hulk, and then Magnussen runs into him from behind. On first watch, when I was taking notes, I thought it was on Magnussen. I thought Magnussen slammed into the back of Albon. That's not what happened, though.
Magnussen had no idea what was going on, and he was ahead of Albon. He actually had the better start of the three. He was the farthest out ahead. And then after we see Magnussen go flying up the inside, then we start to see Albon appear. If you're watching the onboard of Nico Hülkenberg, then we start to see Albon appear up the outside. And like you said, squeezed himself too close to the wall, nowhere to go. Magnussen's getting ready for the turn one, so he's moving towards the outside. So Hulkenberg is just in the middle, like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here. Tries to slam on the brakes, nowhere to go. Clips that back tire of Albon, and Albon slaps Magnussen. Magnussen even comes on afterwards, and he's like, "Who hit me?" And his engineers are like, "I don't know, I wasn't watching."
Goodness. Okay, so that was turn one. Obviously, Jeremiah mentioned the race goes to safety car and then eventually red flags on lap 2. That's the same time when Oscar Piastri is told to that the car is not safe to continue. And there was a thought that a couple of these cars that took damage could be fixed under the red flag. Like maybe Piastri wouldn't actually have to retire. Maybe Daniel Ricciardo could stuff like that. But not so much for all of them because they didn't have that long under the red flag.
Well, the problem is that the safety car was the first thing that came out. And when the safety car came out, everybody did a lap trying to do that with the safety car. Meanwhile, Ricciardo and Piastri pit. And then after they get lapped, then the red flag comes out. So now they have even more time to work on the car. They are able to get everything working properly because as we see in the race, they have great pace. They're just a lap down. So
were they talking about trying to get Leclerc's car back to the pit to fix it or just get it back to the pit?
They were trying to get it back to the pit to fix it after all that incidents happened, and they thought that maybe we could get it back out there in the race.
It was like up on a grass hill. Like, no.
As a matter of fact, the marshals were taking pictures with the Ferrari. Like, there's a picture of the Ferrari beached, and then all the marshals just surrounded by it, giving the old thumbs up.
Goodness. Okay, so the race restarts on lap 3. You do have Ricciardo and Piastri out of the pit lane, like Jeremiah mentioned, because they were able to fix up their cars. The new race order start, though, is now Verstappen, Norris, Hamilton, Alonso, Stroll, Russell, Perez, Sainz, Ocon, Tsunoda. So Hamilton jumps up a couple spots. The Astons drop back a little bit. So you essentially have a new race between your top 3 contenders from the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks maybe,
right,
with Verstappen, Norris, and Hamilton. Coming out of the start on lap 3, Verstappen gets away clean again, and he's ahead by like a second already after the center curves. Norris bogged down. Did you see his onboard? He got stuck in first for like 4 seconds.
Yeah, I don't know what that was about.
His little screen kept showing first, and you could see him trying to do the paddle, and it would not leave first. So that's why Hamilton ends up getting a great jump going outside of Norris. But then old Hamilton locks up as he goes into turn 1 and covers the rest of the field in smoke. Behind there, I saw Sergio Perez charging. Sergio was coming up through the pack. And who did he come up behind? Fernando Alonso. And what did Alonso do? Defended masterfully against the Minister of Defense himself. But it was a pretty clean turn 1 after the events of the first turn 1 that we saw. Okay, before we do key moments of the race, which is what we always like to look at, do you have funny radio calls? Because we like to do this. We usually do it toward the end, but I kind of want to mix it up and do these in the middle.
I do. I've got a couple for you, both of them by none other than the radio king himself, George Russell. On lap 14, George Russell's passed by Perez, to which he comes on the radio and says, "Are we working together here or doing our own race?" After previously, he had already done a radio call to his engineer, basically saying, "I think we should work together on this and try and work our way up the pack." After he gets passed by Perez, though, things kind of fall off at that point. 2 laps later, we see them telling him that he needs to manage around, I forget what turn it is, but one of the turns he needs to manage better around that turn, to which he responds, "Do you want me to race or concede positions?" So at this point, he is massively frustrated.
It was turn 11, and yeah, that was the quote. "Do you want me to race or concede positions?" And they're like, no, we want you to race, not concede positions. He gave the sassiest answers, and the team had to come back and be like, "No, you're fine."
I love how he gets during these races. I want to say, as far as all the drivers go, he's got to be the king of the radio calls.
I have 2 from Lewis Hamilton later in the race, so we'll get into this. But Hamilton was in contention for a little bit, Now towards the end of the race, he fell off, but on lap 50. Gasly just flies past Hamilton right before turn 1 on that straightaway, and they come on the radio to Hamilton. I don't know exactly what the order of this call was, but he says to his team, "I'm in his DRS and still not catching him." He couldn't catch an Alpine with DRS.
Yeah, I think Mercedes just got it wrong with the whole only having one practice session and just not really getting the setup exactly how they wanted. Because I mean, we heard Crofty say it a couple times, and I even heard the fellas on F1 or F1 TV talking about this that it just looked draggy. The Mercedes looked very draggy.
The other call from, where is it? Oh, Hamilton, a couple laps before, they said, Lewis, we can use the tires now, push the pace. And he goes, I've been using the tires the last 5 laps, dude. Just love that dude to his engineer.
That is not a good sign if that says anything about how their race ended up.
Last radio call for me, lap 58, where George Russell is told to retire the car. The engineers say, high and worsening power unit oil temp, your car is at risk of imminent failure. And if you're not sure what imminent failure means in terms of F1, that means it's going to explode.
To put it lightly.
Because if you're also not familiar with how oil and oil temperature works, if it gets hot, it builds up a ton of pressure and explodes.
And we get
it doesn't just catch on fire, it explodes.
No, at that point, shut the car off, get out.
So they bring George in and he retires. Okay, let's go back and look through the key moments. Obviously, we covered turn 1 on lap 1 and then turn 1 on lap 3. The key spots in this race throughout the day were turn 1 and turns 4, because turn 1 comes off that huge straightaway that occurred. It's not a straightaway, it's just a huge fast section between turns 11 and then the restart of the race, right? Which actually covers 3 or 4 curves. And then turns 4 is the one after the big DRS section between turn 3 or 4. And that's where literally every overtake happened, was at turn 1 or turn 4. So here's some of your key moments. Leclerc being out on the formation lap. So the fact that he didn't get to race, the fact that Max started the race in clean air, opened up the chances for Alonso, Hamilton, Perez, and Lando Norris to have a shot in this race. Lando Norris would not have been able to push the pace as much as he did and fight Max the first 10 laps as he did if Charles Leclerc was in the way. There's no way.
Yeah, the only thing that I could see there is if Lando had started in a higher position, because, I mean, while he did shoot up the inside past basically everybody, if he had gotten that second place start or heck, even third, and then Charles Leclerc being out and now he's got that open air in front of him, I think we could have saw a better battle there, because I feel like McLaren rather got a way better start there than Verstappen did.
They did, but again, Verstappen being in the clean air, and when the race restarted on lap 3, you have it now as Verstappen Norris instead of Verstappen and the Aston Martins, because
Right.
Norris was able to make up some ground in that craziness and chaos. I think that led to Norris being competitive throughout the first, like I said, 8 or 10 laps.
Yeah. And we saw that on lap 7 as he tries to take a shot at Verstappen and try and make that move around, which didn't end up working out for him, had to back out. But you could just tell he wants it, man. He wants it bad.
So that brings me to point number 2, which laps 6 through 8 is when Lando lost winning the race. And I know that sounds crazy because, yes, he only finished 8.2 seconds behind Verstappen, but Verstappen was lifting and coasting a lot, and his pit stop strategy was very conservative. He waited really long to change tires. Like, Verstappen was never really under pressure.
Right.
But I think lap 8 is when Norris officially lost, because Lando absolutely cooked his battery down to 0 and then had to spend so many laps recharging. And by him not at least getting ahead of Verstappen and being able to defend for part of the circuit, he was never going to be able to come back from that.
No, that was rough to see. And, it's not like Lando had a lot of people like pressure behind him from Lewis Hamilton as Mercedes were trying to figure things out for themselves. But I just really felt like Lando was going to have an opportunity here to at least take the lead for a bit, and maybe they have a go for a few laps. But no, he just kind of, Verstappen sailed off into the sunset like he always does.
The McLaren has the pace. It just didn't have that finishing speed. Like, he would get to the finish line every time in like a metaphorical finish line, and then just couldn't quite inch ahead of Verstappen. And that was every single time they were going to turn 1 and every single time they were going to turn 4. Lando would be lighting it up on the slipstream and the DRS, but then just didn't have enough room. And maybe he could have been more aggressive. Maybe he could have dive bombed a corner or something, but then you risk your entire day. And when you're a guy trying to work his way up from a horrible first half of the season with a really good back half of the season, number 2 is a lot better than a DNF.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Okay, point number 3, George Russell told to lift and coast early, starting around lap 10. That continued through the duration of the race. George Russell really wasn't a factor in this race.
No, which kind of stinks because he actually had better pace than Lewis Hamilton, and we saw that, and that's why he got so frustrated around lap 14 to 16 there. But at the end of the day, the Mercedes tires just kind of went away from them, and they didn't really have any kind of fight in them whatsoever.
So with Leclerc being out on the formation lap and George Russell essentially being out, pace-wise with the whole lift and coast and the whole oil pressure thing, which ended up retiring the car, you have 2 top 6, top 7 drivers out of contention, which again opens that door for those Aston Martins to stay competitive. It opens the door for Perez to get back up in the top, for Sainz to get back under the top. All those things can happen because you have 2 contenders that aren't holding people up anymore. Although I really would have liked to have seen both. I would have liked to seen a competitive day from Leclerc and the Mercedes, because obviously that's more exciting. But I do think we got a ton of dogfights in this race without those guys.
And I'm hoping you'll cover one of them as we continue through this.
So that takes me to point number 4, dogfight I want to cover, which is Sergio Perez versus Fernando Alonso.
Oh, I loved this fight.
I have this recorded as a 16-lap battle between laps 56 and 71.
That's what I've got.
And laps 56 through 70 are all Sergio Perez chasing down Fernando Alonso. And then lap 71 is Alonso chasing down Sergio Perez.
Which was even more exciting considering the fact that we have a car that's massively underpowered compared to, the Red Bull. But then we have the smarter driver, the more experienced driver in Alonso, and then we have Sergio with the mistakes that he made there at the end, giving Alonso an opportunity. I'll let you tell the story from there, but I love this fight.
Let me do a quick summary of the 16-lap battle between Alonso and Perez. Lap 56, Perez is finally within closing distance. He's worked 20-plus laps since pit stops or whatever it was to get within closing distance of Alonso in third. Perez finally closes in at turn 1 and turn 4, but similar to like we were mentioning with Lando Norris chasing Max, he just didn't quite have enough to get past Alonso on lap 56. Lap 57, I guess Perez is charging a little bit because Alonso stretches the lead out back to like that 0.8 to 1 second lead, so they were kind of taking a lap off. Lap 58, Perez staying within 1 second. He would get up to like 0.3, 0.2 in every turn, and then he'd back off again. I skip ahead 4 laps to lap 60, and I just put Perez and Alonso back at it again because that's when the camera shifted back to Sergio charging up every single DRS straight, chasing after them. Where it gets really, really interesting is lap 70. They go back and forth for like 10 laps with Perez really just keeping about a half-second gap on him, like setting up for a final kind of lap shootout, essentially. Although I think Perez made his move too early, because on lap 70, Perez goes inside at turn 1 when he'd been going outside almost every single time before that, and he takes third from Alonso at turn 1 right before the Senna S curves. Perez, though, is immediately defending between turns 3 and 4 because that's the disadvantage. If you take the lead in turn 1, you're at a disadvantage going into turn 4. Alonso gains enough on lap 70 to get wheel to wheel, but not enough to get around, and Perez leads through the midsection. On the final lap, Alonso, now with the DRS and slipstream on Perez, doesn't quite have enough at turn 1, but at turn 4, he swings outside, whips around Sergio Perez, and retakes third going into the midsection at Sao Paulo. Perez defended, but Alonso had the pace. It was an all-out drag race coming down the home straight.
We saw this coming as Alonso starts to climb up behind Sergio in that turn 1 on the final lap. We see Sergio take a compromised line going into turn 1. This is going to set him up because of the way that turns 2 and 3 are set up. If you have a bad line going into turn 1, you are having a bad line for turns 2 and 3. So by the time that we get to turn 4, Alonso, who's been taking it clean, by the way, takes a perfect clean line for turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, gets right up on the gearbox for gearbox of Perez going into the final DRS straight, or not the final, but the lap. The turn 4 DRS straight. He's right up on the gearbox of Perez. Perez with no ability to defend because you have all this pace of him coming down with the DRS, flies up there, gets right past him, and at that point, once you get past turn 4 and go into turns 5 and 6, pretty much at that point stuck behind the person until we get to the exit of turn 12 in the final straight.
So as we exit turn 12 and we round 13, which is essentially just a rounding turn, all out drag race. You have Perez at 0.2 to 0.3 behind Alonso, trying to stay in his slipstream, trying to keep the DRS going. And it looks for a little bit like Alonso's going to win pretty handily until they get to where the track actually straightened out. Perez whips to the right, goes outside, and gets wheel to wheel by the time the checkered flag comes. And you're like, who won? Who won? It was neck and neck. They were wheel to wheel. But hang on. The finish line is not where the checkered flag is. No. It's like 100 meters back. So if you're watching this on TV, and this is something F1 needs to improve, like they need like a first down line like we have in football or something.
Just put out a white line, a digital white line.
Yeah, put out a white line or broadcast something on the track, because there's a lot of different lines on the F1 grid, obviously. You have the start line, which is what every driver lines up behind to start the race. That doesn't matter anymore after they start the race. Then you have where the person with the checkered flag is. And apparently that doesn't matter either. It's just wherever they have a little booth for a person with a flag to stand, and it has no bearing on the actual race. And then way back in front of everything, you have the timing line or the start-finish line or the finish line. And it's just a regular white line on the track. But if you're watching the TV broadcast, you could not see that line.
No, I
So
definitely
whenever
didn't.
they actually passed was right when Perez had whipped to the outside to the right, is when that they had crossed over that line, and essentially Perez's front tires were in line with Alonso's back tires.
Yeah, it was an awesome fight between the two. What was it, 0.05 of a second between the two?
Yeah, 0.053 is the gap.
So 53 thousandths of a second. Jeez.
And Alonso wins. Again, if that track had been 50 meters longer, Perez would have won, or won that spot at least, which is crazy.
Yeah, and then especially so whenever you see, I mean, like you said, you can't see the line whatsoever. So when it comes to where they stand and actually wave the flag, which is where I thought the finish was, Perez is ahead of Alonso. So I was sitting there thinking, oh, I'm happy for Perez. He's finally back on the podium, but I kind of wanted to see Alonso get a podium. And then I look at the results, and it's Alonso in third. I'm like, oh, right.
Jeremiah's a big Aston Martin homer, if you weren't aware.
I'm a big Fernando Alonso homer. Relax.
Okay, so your race finishes, and you have the order as Verstappen, Norris, Alonso, Perez. Stroll holds fifth spot, only dropping 2 from his original third.
Boom.
Sainz in 6, Gasly, Hamilton finishes in the 8th spot, followed by Yuki Tsunoda 9 and Esteban Ocon 10. Logan Sargent just misses the points in 11th.
Go figure.
Okay, we talked about big moments. We did radio calls, and we did that they need to change the start-finish line. Let's do winners and losers. I'll kick it off. Winners for the day. Lando Norris. I think he showed really good promise early in the race. Obviously, their car just isn't on Red Bull's level, but he is showing that he is an elite driver. And that is something that I've held off saying, and I know my opinion has no bearing on anybody, but we just haven't seen excellence out of him. And I think this year, like you want to say, Lando, get a win. You need a win in Formula One. That's really hard to do when the guy you're driving against is Max Verstappen and he has that car.
I'd agree with that. Is that all your winners?
Other winner.
Oh.
I don't really want to steal your thunder, but Aston Martin, welcome back to the party. You quali 3-4 with Lance Stroll leading, mind you, and you finish not only 3-5, but you beat a Red Bull in a drag race?
Not only that, but if you looked at actual where Lance Stroll was in terms of the results, he was only, 6.5 seconds behind the fight between Alonso and Perez. It's not like he was 14 seconds back. No, he was still relatively close in comparison of Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll.
Because there was a 9-second gap between him and Carlos Sainz.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, welcome back, Aston Martin. I don't know if this is going to hold over to Las Vegas or not, but
we'll see.
Okay, who are your winners?
Max Verstappen, obviously, pretty much every race. Well done. Takes the lead, holds the lead, whatever. Same thing. Anyway, Lando Norris, I do want to talk about this because you did mention this. Lando Norris has shown that he is one of the faster drivers, but with a non-comparable car compared to that Red Bull. It's just not going to be a thing. In fact, I would say if Red Bull had a car that was closer to the performance of that McLaren, that Lando probably would have a win at some point this season, if not already. That's just my personal opinion. I'm a big Lando fan, and I feel like he does show a lot out of that McLaren car. In fact, we haven't seen Piastri really anywhere recently in these past few races.
He struggled.
He's been struggling these past few weekends, and I understand that. I mean, he keeps getting damaged, but at the end of the day, stop getting damaged. You know, I mean, as far as my final winner, because you stole my thunder, I'm still going to say it. Aston Martins. I love this, man. I love this mainly because Fernando Alonso back on the podium. Awesome. And with that dogfight with Perez in the back. I mentioned already Lance Stroll being only 6.5 seconds back, but Lance Stroll had a great race too. The fact that, he did start at a very high position, but he held it for the entirety of the race. That alone says stuff because typically we see him falling back early. And Aston Martin is a winner because no car problems. It feels like these past few weekends, they just keep it. Oh, Lance Stroll or Lance, you have to retire the car. Or Alonso, we need you to come into the pits. We're retiring the car. No, none of that.
Remember Alonso in Singapore, how wheels off Alonso was?
Yeah.
Flying over pit lane barriers and
oh, geez.
Such a different performance. And I mean, to wrap up the Aston Martin thing, you didn't just hold on to the third spot, with Perez chasing up. You got past and then retook the position.
That was all that racecraft and experience that Fernando Alonso possesses through these years of racing. He was able to just take the perfect line, just like you should, and stayed behind Sergio as long as he could until Sergio finally made the one mistake in the entirety of that whole debacle, and he capitalizes on it. Awesome.
Losers, Charles Leclerc, rough day. Real rough day. This is the bigger one, though. Mercedes. Because we did this in our preview. Again, we did the math in our preview for how, Mercedes is trying to hold on to second in the constructors from Ferrari. And then Lewis is trying to take second in the drivers from Sergio. And this race did not help them at all, especially when we only have, 2 races left in the season?
Right.
So when you look at it, Lewis is now 32 points behind Sergio Perez. You need 2 really good races, and you need Sergio to have 2 really bad races. And that was a vastly different story coming into this race where it looked like Lewis could so easily pass Sergio for second. It now, to me, it's not impossible, but it's almost impossible. 32 points in 2 races when you're struggling.
Yeah, especially when Sergio is having a return to form. We'll see if he hangs on and actually
if
continues
Sergio just gets points, essentially
Right.
Sergio gets points in every race, it's going to be almost impossible.
Right. Unless Lewis just comes out and wins the last 2 races outright with the fastest lap, and that's not going to happen.
And then you flip over to the constructor standing where they had a solid lead on the Ferraris. That lead is only 20 points now over Ferrari.
Now, granted, Charles Leclerc not finishing the race whatsoever, not even starting the race, that's going to kind of hold the same. But Carlos Sainz got some good points, and Lewis Hamilton did not.
No, Sainz finished 6th, Hamilton finished 8th. And again, when you have a 20-point gap going into the final couple races of the season, anything's on the table. If Mercedes has 2 more decent to bad races and Ferrari knocks it out of the park, which Ferrari very well could knock it out of the park in Vegas with that being a speed track.
Oh, yeah.
If they get 2-3 in Las Vegas, they're taking second in the constructors.
We see how they did in Monza. We saw how they did in Mexico City. So, I mean, in terms of those tracks where you do have those high speed packages and you are able to get to the higher ends of what your car can do, Ferrari has a good car. So it's going to be tough for Mercedes. They're definitely going to have to nail it in the practice sessions and in that setup.
All right, bring us home with your losers.
Losers, Mercedes, I'm not going to go into that. We did enough of that. Ferrari, I'm going to say is the loser because they gave a bad car to Leclerc. I'm not going to give Leclerc the loss because he, to no fault, was out of that race. To no fault. Ferrari had all the fault there as they were not able to build the car properly. I mean, there's no other way to put that. Albon, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you the L for this race. You went for a hole. I understand that. You should always do that, especially according to the Brazilian legend Ayrton Senna, who says that you need to go for every single hole. Otherwise, you're not a driver. I messed that up a little bit, but whatever. but unfortunately you tried to make it happen, got a little too close to Hulk, and wrecked out. I'm going to give you the loss for that. My other two losers, unfortunately, are going to be Piastri and Ricciardo to no fault of their own. They just succumbed to damage and then had to pit, get that damaged fixed, and they were a lap down for the rest of the race. There's nothing they could do there. I'm going to have to give you the loser spot for that.
All right, there you go. We have 2 races left in the season. We get a week off this weekend, and then we're in Vegas on the 19th, which is actually Sunday the 19th at 12 a.m. So really like Saturday night is when that race is. And then we have Abu Dhabi to bring the season home the Sunday after Thanksgiving in the United States, November 26th. So let me know this. We've had the battle for 2 this whole back half of the season. Does Hamilton get 2 podium finishes in a row to take the number 2 spot away from Sergio? Let me know.
More importantly, does Aston Martin go 1-2 in Las Vegas with Lance Stroll winning his first ever race? If you think that, I'm on board with you. I believe in you. I think we're going to take this thing home.
All right, guys, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.